Offers reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome along. Day 5 of war in Europe. The largest country in Europe continues its invasion of the second largest. At this hour, loud explosions are rocking Kiev. We'll talk to those within and without Ukraine, including a senior advisor to President Zelensky, on various aspects of the war, including where it's likely to go for the West. Plus, the most vital part of the show, we can't do that without you, your comments and your questions. They're all the more important when we live in the constant swirl of a blizzard of lies. So send them along to gbviews at gbnews.uk, that's email, or you can tweet me at gbnews. But first, as ever, the news with Miranda Shunka.
Hello, the top stories from the GB newsroom. Talks to reach an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine with Russia have ended, with the two sides agreeing to hold a second round of talks in the next few days. Earlier today, Ukraine's president signed a formal request to join the European Union, with Poland's foreign minister saying they'll support the accession process. Boris Johnson has told President Zelensky more UK support is on its way as shelling continues. The Ukrainian army has also released a video claiming to show the destruction of a Russian missile system. Well, the Foreign Secretary has told the Commons President Putin's invasion of Ukraine is not proceeding to plan. Liz Truss said the UK will impose further sanctions against Moscow and told MPs there'll be a full asset freeze on all Russian banks within days.
He expected to take cities quickly. He expected Ukraine to retreat, and he expected the West to be divided. Instead, his forces were met by the heroism of President Zelensky and the resolute determination of the Ukrainian people. He has been met by a united West, together with our friends around the world, and we have taken decisive action.
Well, this is all as at least 11 people were killed during rocket strikes by Russian forces in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. Earlier, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said the violence is totally unacceptable and enough is enough.
Yesterday, Russian nuclear forces were put on high alert. This is a chilling development. The mere idea of a nuclear conflict is simply inconceivable. Nothing can justify the use of nuclear weapons.
Well, 500,000 people are now thought to have fled Ukraine since the invasion began, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. It follows news that Britain's likely to follow the EU's lead in taking Ukrainian refugees for the next 3 years. The policy is due to be reviewed in the coming days. Football's governing bodies FIFA and UEFA have suspended Russia from all competitions. It means they won't be participating in the World Cup this year in Qatar, including the men's playoffs next month, and the ban will last until further notice. Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Mark Steyn.
As everyone should know, after the last 2 years, Western governments are happy to lie to their citizens in the interests of the so-called greater good. The Daily Telegraph, for example, tells us that inside Downing Street it is widely accepted that the COVID originated in a laboratory in Wuhan, not in an errant bat or pangolin, but they haven't figured out a way to tell us yet, because we're simple-minded peasants who might storm number 10 and demand that we get as tough on the Chi-Coms as we're getting on Putin and boot Chairman Xi out of the Eurovision Song Contest and impose trade sanctions so that he can no longer sell us his cheap slave labour-produced T-shirts and socks and underwear and aspirins and COVID masks and computer chips and batteries and laptops and smartphones and basically everything we need in an advanced society. It's important to remember those COVID lies now that we have a new crisis, war in Europe, a big war that could spread. The retired generals on American telly assure us the war is not going well for the Ruskies. That could be true. There has been no Pentagon-style shock and awe for 72 hours, followed by the long, slow bleed to defeat over the ensuing 2 decades. So it might just be that Putin is not going to war with the Pentagon's useless playbook and is trying something different that doesn't lead to a humiliating Kabul-style rout. Who knows? The violence was significantly cranked up today, including the reported use of cluster bombs in Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, which, if true, is a war crime. But in whatever numbers, real people are dying in Ukraine, and it looks as if America's post-Cold War moment could be dying with them. The continent's great liberations of three decades ago restored the ancient capitals east of Berlin to the common European home. Putin would like to roll that back, starting with Ukraine. And we're responding with hashtags and Eurovision expulsions and the projection of the Ukrainian flag on Nelson's column. We could use Lord Nelson right now, but we have to make do with a light show on his memorial. And the head of MI6, that's C in real life, M if you're a 007 fan, and actually Y would seem the more obvious choice these days. The head of MI6 says it's more important to show Putin how serious we are by going back to celebrating LGBTQ month as if nothing were happening. It's like the dinner party scene in Carry On Up the Khyber. Yes, indeed, only with more non-binary Khybers. On the other hand, the Ukrainians themselves aren't necessarily waiting for NATO or for the Americans. They're doing a splendid job resisting what is happening in their country. You've seen some of the more amusing aspects of that, including a Ukrainian farmer dragging a rather elderly-looking Russian tank that managed to run out of gas. I'm joined now by Alexander Rodnyansky, who's a senior advisor to the president of Ukraine and joins us, I think, from just outside Kyiv. And the Rodnyansky family goes back a long way with President Zelensky, all the way back to his TV days, because this is the young Mr. Rodnyansky, and his father is a big-time media mogul in Ukraine who first met Mr. Zelensky back when he was doing a comedy show on that network. How is the spirit of the Ukrainian government holding up after these talks today, Alexander?
Well, thank you for having me. The spirit is good. We're in good spirits. We're resisting the enemy, doing everything we can and holding up.
Well, it's reported generally that Putin's invasion isn't going the way he'd like it to go, that he expected, in effect, to have his flag running up the flagpole outside Government House in Kyiv today. Is it your view, too, that he's running into more resistance than he expected?
Absolutely. Just like you've reported, he's had significant backlash. He didn't expect that. Nobody's welcoming the Russian troops in Ukraine. That's something that they have miscalculated tremendously. And we see local population even in the southern city of Berdyansk, which they have taken because there were no troops. We see local population in this southern city come out and revolt against them essentially already now. And this goes to show that even in this eastern part of Ukraine, where essentially he shouldn't have as much resistance as in the West, nobody wants to see any Russian troops. And so that's just testimony to how much miscalculation there has been probably on the Kremlin side.
What do you think Putin wants in the end? There seems to be a lot of thought that he doesn't want the whole country, but he wants to take the east and the southern shore up to Odessa to effectively exclude you from the Black Sea permanently, to tighten his grip on Crimea and to take Odessa, which in historical terms he looks on as his anyway. Is that your view of the situation, or do you think he actually wants to go for the whole country?
Well, it's hard to say. I think he actually wants to go for the whole country. We see that from the bombings. We see that from the airstrikes, which have hit the city of Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, so the very western part of Ukraine. If he didn't have any ambitions for that part, he probably wouldn't be striking there either. So it's hard to get into his head, but as far as we can tell, he's just basically, he's just a function of his imperial ambitions, this person. So he knows he can't do anything about the economy in Russia for years. It's been in stagnation. And so the only thing that appears to be driving him is to be the modern Peter the Great, if you want to restore the empire. So I guess it would be all of Ukraine, as crazy as that sounds.
Now, you've responded just over the weekend with a demand to the European Union to be admitted for membership instantly. And just in the last hour or so, the European Parliament, a motion supported by all the parties in that Parliament, has suggested that there is widespread support for at least announcing the beginning of the process. Do you think that's enough, or do you think the European Union need to recognise that these are special circumstances? You've been invaded, you're part of the common European home, and they need to accelerate the process?
Well, I think everybody should do the best they can to accelerate the process. It's already a good sign that we have come this far in this special time. It has both symbolic meaning, but also real economic meaning that could stand behind this. So if we were to enter the European Union, of course, we would have a lot more economic support than we currently do. So yes, I think this should be accelerated and it should go as quickly as possible at this point.
What about if all the present members of the EU were to meet and to say, I mean, clearly it would be a provocative step to take to Putin, but at the same time it would change the geopolitical dynamic, because if they were to say, even if they were to say, we declare, pending further investigation, we declare Ukraine an honorary member of the European Union, it would put Putin at war with the EU and change the dynamic. Would you be in favour of them actually all getting together on a big Zoom call and actually declaring that?
Well, I think this is what I meant by saying it would have symbolic meaning, because if Ukraine is really part of the EU, then it just makes it so much harder to politically have a claim on Ukraine for Russia or for Putin. And so I think, yes, in some sense, I would agree with what you said. It would make it harder. It would probably help us prevent further conflict, but it's easier said than done. And of course, the accession in itself does not happen overnight.
Are you disappointed in the Americans' reaction? Biden, there were two parties in the United States. Biden is supposedly the guy in the Oval Office, but he spent the weekend out in Baltimore at his home. And it's not clear to me they've offered you anything terribly practical, except they called your president and offered him a flight out, in the way that the Afghan guy got out with a big plane full of money. But your president isn't planning on doing that. Are you slightly insulted that that was the only practical offer from the Americans?
So I wouldn't put it this way at all, of course. So first of all, we are grateful to all of our allies, to all of the support that we are receiving from the US, from the European Union, from all the Europeans, from Great Britain in particular. I mean, you have really been on the side of truth here from the very beginning, never had any illusions about the Russian regime. So a special thank you to all the Brits. I wouldn't say that we're disappointed with the US. We have received tremendous support from the US. And I wouldn't just boil it down to what you just said about the offer to rescue the president. We're not leaving anywhere. This is our country. As everybody can see, we've been standing firm. We're taking the fight to the enemy, and there's no way they can succeed. Even in the worst case scenario, whenever they take any cities, there's no way they can control these cities. And that's just an axiom. It's a fact.
Are you impressed by the number of Ukrainians? If you check almost any border post, it's women and children who are leaving, and the men aged 18 to 60 have stayed to fight. And from all we can tell, most of them seem eager to fight. But we've also seen scenes of women learning how to make a Molotov cocktail in case the Russians decide to come into the cities and go door to door. It's not something we saw in Kabul. It's not something we saw in the same way in other conflicts. Do you think that the Ukrainian will is actually greater than these miserable-looking Russian conscripts in their rusting tanks?
Well, that's certainly what I would say, and that's certainly what we seem to be observing over the last few days. I mean, the will to fight in the Ukrainian armed forces and just in the general population is extremely high. This is our land. We are facing an invasion, outside aggression for no apparent reason, except for someone's sick ambitions. So that's exactly right. Our will is to stand firm. On the other hand, just like you said, I'm not sure the Russian soldiers know exactly what they're doing here themselves. And there have been reports that, it's even the ethnically Russian or Slavic soldiers that were really unwilling often to go enter Ukraine. And there has been some problem for the Russian army in terms of, just motivating these people to follow their orders. And that's another reason, perhaps, why they're trying to involve not just ethnically Russian troops into this fight. So it's exactly the type of dynamic that you've described.
There are stories that Russian soldiers are being offered 5 million rubles to throw down their weapons and run away. Is that true?
I think that is true. This today was actually announced as one of the initiatives that our government is putting out to essentially encourage the enemy forces to lay down their arms and just not participate in this criminal warfare.
And do you think that will be taken up by them? They'd have no great reputation. The Russian army fights either very brutally and violently and illegally in terms of international war, or it doesn't fight well at all. That's the story out of Chechnya. It's either committing atrocities or it's completely ineffectual. At the moment, we still seem to be in the ineffectual stage in Ukraine. Are you worried that that Putin might just get mad and order them to engage in the kind of bloody massacres we saw in Chechnya?
Exactly. That's exactly right. I actually tweeted about this today. And my fear is that now that their offensive has failed, and we know from pretty reliable sources by now that they were expecting to take Kiev within days, 2 or 3 days, as well as Kharkiv, so the big cities. That has clearly failed miserably. And so as that is failing, perhaps what we're seeing today with all these attacks, completely undiscriminatory attacks on civilians and the bombings of civilian buildings in Kharkiv and also in Kiev, is a sort of a Syrian strategy, if you want, of Russian warfare, where they're just essentially bombing indiscriminately those cities, probably with the objective of driving out the civilian population entirely, such that then they can just attack anything and anyone without reservation. So that might be one, awful strategy that they're following, just like you said, because they're basically losing their mind and realizing that the initial offensive has failed.
Did you get any sense from this meeting in Belarus today on the Belarus border that Putin knows what he's doing with any clarity? He wasn't at the meeting, but people connected to him were. Did they give you any indication that they knew what they were doing, that they had a long-term strategic vision of where this is going?
Unfortunately, I don't think those meetings were yielded any serious or significant results. I don't think they were in any way a success. I'm not sure the Russian side at this point is serious about those conversations. They repeated the same demands that they had put out before us, in particular that we recognize Crimea as Russian and that we demilitarize, as they say. So I'm not even sure what that means. I guess it means giving up all the weapons that we have. So that's just a complete no-go. I mean, there's no way we can discuss any of this. And they stand firm on these demands. So I think these meetings and these conversations that we've had are just another trick, probably on the part of the Russians, to pretend that they are in some way interested in peace, whereas in fact everything that they do seems to suggest that they're not interested in peace so far.
If that's correct, if your assessment is correct, that means that this thing is going to be decided in the streets and in the Ukrainian countryside not only by Ukrainian armed forces, but by your citizenry, by fellas like that farmer towing the tank away. Is that your view of it, that in fact you're going to have to inflict such pain on the Red Army that they go away and don't come back?
Well, that is my fear. My fear is that this might become a very protracted, long-lasting conflict, kind of like we're seeing in Syria, where our cities become empty over time, become destroyed, and then it's just essentially a lot of fighting over the years. I hope it doesn't happen, of course. I hope it will become too costly for the Russian population to just sit and watch and wait. I hope that something will happen in Russia. I mean, the ultimate solution to this is within Russia. And the root cause of everything that's happening, again, is obviously within Russia. The fact that they have no democracy, the fact that they're basically a repressive, autocratic state, and there's no opposition whatsoever. So, and true democracies, as we know, don't really go to war against each other. And the only time we really do see war is almost always with the participation of an autocratic state. And so that's the root cause, and I think that the solution will also be in that domain. And that is my fear, that we will have a very protracted war, but I hope it doesn't happen.
Let me just ask you a quick final question, Alexander, on that. Are you surprised by the level of anti-war protests in Russia? I believe the official figure is that 6,000 anti-war protesters have been arrested on the streets of Russia, which I take it means the real figure is actually higher. Have you been surprised by these anti-war protests under Putin?
I wasn't really surprised. I mean, I'm glad to see that people are going out, but I would like to see a lot more people. Now, of course, this is for Russians to decide. But at this point, I mean, there's really no holding back. I mean, we have a war in our country. We have people and children dying every day. Russia needs to rise if there's still some semblance of a conscience in Russia. So they really need to rise. That's what we did in 2014 when we fought for our democracy.
Well, stay strong, Alexander. It looks as if this is proving much trickier for Putin than he ever dreamed it would be. And in war, it doesn't matter whether you're a superpower or it doesn't matter whether you're the smallest country on earth. In war, the decisive factor is will, and your will seems to be greater than that of Russia. We're going to come back. We got lots more on the show today, so stick around, and we will see you in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News. Coming up on Dan Wootton Tonight, we'll bring you the latest analysis on the war in Europe as the world comes to terms with Russia's previously unthinkable invasion of Ukraine and ponders just what on earth can be done to stop Putin. Plus, Russian-British commentator and friend of the show Konstantin Kisin explores whether a divided, distracted and weak West emboldened Moscow. And one of Britain's most outrageous stand-ups, Roy Chubby Brown, weighs in on attempts to cancel him after 6 decades of gags and the woke war on comedy. And as ever, I'm joined by my superstar panel, the Daily Express columnist Carol Malone, social commentator Esther Kraku, and senior reporter at the newspaper Benjamin Butterworth. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Hey, let's get to your comments. We wanted to know what the West's role in Ukraine should be, if any. Mike says via Twitter, you mean aside from already arming the Ukrainians to the teeth? Well, the United States did that with Afghanistan, and all that meant was that the Taliban is now, I think, the 8th or 9th biggest military on the planet. That was a fabulous gift to the Taliban from the United States taxpayer, courtesy of those boobs at the Pentagon. The difference here seems to be that the Ukrainians are actually willing to pick up those weapons and use them. That's the difference. As we were talking about, it's not about how many tanks you have, it's about how much will you've got. And will is a very, as everybody knows, even when great powers take on small powers, will is the one thing you can't make a weapon that just extinguishes. John from Twitter says, why on earth do people vote for Brexit when more refugees and illegal migrants are coming here than ever before? I wouldn't disagree with that. It's very depressing. But basically, the EU, the UK, everybody else just immediately fell into Syrian mode. Oh, yes, the first thing we need to do is to open all our borders and take all these refugees. Well, in case you haven't noticed, the military age men, 18 to 60, are staying in Ukraine and fighting for their country. That's what we should have told all those nice young Syrian chappies when they showed up at Europe's borders. Go back where you came from, pick a side, and let us know how it all shakes out. The only good thing that might come of this is that the refugees, at the moment, the refugees from Ukraine are women and children. The refugees arriving on the English shore every day are fit, young, strapping men. From the Middle East and Africa. So maybe the fit, young, strapping men could all marry the Ukrainian women and children in the fullness of time, and Britain's nitwitted refugee policy and the European Union's nitwitted refugee policy might accidentally work out well for everyone concerned. Or another John via Twitter says, the West's role in Ukraine is of the... I'm all for metaphors, John. I don't quite get this one. The West's role in Ukraine is of the vegan sausage variety, lacking in substance and utterly tasteless. So if I follow this butcher's analogy, the vegan sausage is the West. That would make the red meat sausage Putin. He's the blood sausage. Is that where this? As I said, I like a bit of analogy, like a bit of metaphor. Don't quite buy the vegan sausage theory of global conflagration. Marcus says, I would not only freeze out Russia completely, but I would also ban all imports from China. Well, I'm all for turning on a dime as the Germans did over the weekend. Turning on a sixpence, I guess I should say. Let's keep it in proper currency. I'm all for turning on a sixpence as the Germans did over the weekend. But basically, the West, the most catastrophic decision the West made 30 years ago was to outsource its entire manufacturing base to China, including of things that hadn't actually been invented 30 years ago, like laptops and smartphones, all of which China now makes. So it outsourced, on the one hand, it outsourced its entire manufacturing to China, and on the other hand, it outsourced its energy supply to Russia. That's obviously catastrophic and catastrophically stupid. The question is whether the Chinese thing should have been done 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we should have introduced plans to decouple from China. If you think it's hard for the Ukrainians to go to war against the Russians, don't be fooled for a minute by all this talk about how if the Chinese take Taiwan, America will go to war against China. America can't go to war against China because the Chinese make all their medicines. They make all their basic medicines, like aspirins and suppositories. So 3 days into the war, every American fighter pilot will have a splitting headache and an itchy bottom. And that war isn't going to be going anywhere. So we should be decoupling from China and from Russia. Whether we actually do so remains to be seen. Our screens have been filled with very striking images these last few days. Families camping out in tube stations, doubling as bomb shelters. Butchers and cab drivers and accountants learning how to use assault rifles. Ladies, waitresses improvising Molotov cocktails. And footage like this of civilians trying to get out of Ukraine's capital city. The man who shot some of these images, Alex Lourie, joins me now from Kiev. Alex, what's it like in the city tonight?
Hey, good to be here. So what's it like in the city right now? Well, it's curfew, so it's pretty quiet. Basically, any conflict is this cyclical rotation of intensity and nightmare world, and then boredom and quiet and wondering what the next thing is. And we're currently in the latter.
Well, let me ask you about that any conflict line, because you covered a lot of the disturbances that arose in American cities after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So you were in Kenosha, Wisconsin, for example, which is what led to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial and his eventual acquittal. Now, when we looked on those images, those cities are ablaze. You've got fast food outlets going up in flames, precinct houses being destroyed, police precinct houses. How does Ukraine compare to those American cities you covered a year or two back?
That's apples and oranges. I mean, one, what you're talking about in Minneapolis and Kenosha were civil unrest, and that I would say that the main sources of danger come from small arms, people with guns who you don't really know. It's interesting you bring up Kenosha, because I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, so to speak, in the U.S. during those events, because one thing that we have a real big issue with in America is mass shootings. And to this day, I'm shocked, pleasantly shocked, that there wasn't a mass shooting during that summer. But yeah, I mean, you're on the. What's worse about this conflict is, I was also in Iraq and Syria, and there, you're always with the more professional, more advanced military. Here, the enemy has air power, has you're not dealing with insurgents with Kalashnikovs and mortars. You're dealing with Russia, and it's apples and oranges, is what I would say.
Are you worried that it could turn really bloody? The Russians have form in this, and Mr. Putin has form in this, that he tiptoes around for a couple of days trying to be nice and not slaughtering a big bunch of civilians, and eventually his patience runs out. We had word today from Ukraine's second city that his patience may be running out. Are you worried about that?
I'm deeply worried about that, and I want to emphasize that I'm not a military man. I'm not sitting in the Pentagon or sitting in the Kremlin, privy to any critical information. But it seems that the Ukrainians are doing better than expected, and the Russians are doing worse than expected, and that's great from the point of view of this country defending itself. What I am very apprehensive about is that if Russia gets frustrated with the lack of progress, then they really only know how to do one thing. Grozny, Aleppo, I'm scared of that, yes.
Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. Stay strong there, and we'll check in with you in a couple of days and see how events are unfolding. Alex, thank you very much, and I hope the night passes peacefully. Martin Helme joins me now. He was until last year Estonia's finance minister, and he's the leader of the Conservative People's Party. And he spent his boyhood scrapping with Russians, as almost all Estonians did. And he joins me now. I have to ask you this: you're a 5-hour drive, I think it is, to St. Petersburg. I did half of that journey, didn't get all the way once, but I figure it's about 5 hours. That's awfully close. Are you worried about it, that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, about what comes next?
Yes, well, I have to just say you pronounce my name in Estonia Helme. Sorry to be a bore about it. And it is a 5-hour drive from Tallinn to St. Petersburg. And, the Western Europeans often talk about the Middle Europe or the Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. Well, we don't really have much more of a buffer between Russia and us than the Narva River, which is not a very big river. So I'd say the atmosphere in Estonia is quite febrile in the last days. The war started last week on our 104th Independence Day. And of course, our first independence only lasted for 20 years. After we had vanquished the Russian Red Army in 1920, they came back 1940, and we didn't manage to push them back. So we've now had 30 years of independence, and I'm afraid it's coming up again, that time to check whether we are worthy of our country. Yes, I do believe that when Russians finish in Ukraine, the next logical step will be the Baltic countries. And I'd want to say this: what Putin and Russia is doing is very systematical. Putin started his regime in Caucasus by basically establishing the will of the Russia in Chechnya, then moved on to Georgia in 2008, right after the Olympic Games, by the way, then moved on to eastern Ukraine in 2014. Then a few years ago, basically took over Belarus with the help of the naive West, who tried to have a colored revolution there and drove Lukashenko into a corner where he had to beg for help from Putin, and now Putin owns him. So when Putin said that the biggest geopolitical disaster or tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, he's basically collected all the pieces except for Ukraine and the Baltics. And once they have their collection, Ukraine in their collection, they will come to Baltic countries.
Well, that's very interesting what you said about Lukashenko. The West have been blundering around like not terribly well-informed tourists in this part of the world. Andy Biggs, who was a very senior counselor to President Trump, said on this network on Thursday that just as Americans weren't willing to go to war for Ukraine, they weren't willing to go to war for Estonia either. Now, there's a difference. You're in NATO, you're in the European Union. There's an Article 5 commitment to defend Estonia. Are you disturbed when you hear Americans walking back from that Article 5 commitment?
Well, I think, I saw war in Ukraine almost the minute that I saw Americans losing the war in Afghanistan. This is, I mean, there are three wars that can happen after Afghanistan. One is China against Taiwan. The other one is North Korea against South Korea. And then there is maybe Iran against Israel, and then Russia against Ukraine and the Baltic countries. And any one of them that starts will make the likelihood of the next one much bigger. So I don't see all of this that has happened in the past few days as something irrational. This is very systematic, and I don't share the euphoria. I'm very thrilled, and I'm very proud about the Ukrainian resistance. But this has been prepared very thoroughly for a very long time. A few days of bad luck in a war, in a very big war. Ukraine is a very big country, and the distances are very big. And if they don't, their initial plan, of course, was to shock and awe and bring about the collapse of the defense. They hit the targets with all the might they have, but now they have moved into the next phase. So the next phase will be grinding the Ukrainian forces, and also I think one of the biggest dangers for Ukrainians right now is that their forces in the east against Donbas and Luhansk, their forces are in the danger of being surrounded or taken from the back by the forces that Russia is moving in from the south. If they stay there, they might be surrounded. If they move from there, then they untie the Russian forces in the eastern front, and this is a very, very bad choice that the Ukrainians are facing. And I also agree with your previous guest who said that, Russians don't care about human life. If they decide to start just razing block by block parts of Kiev or Kharkov, then they will do that. Another very important and very significant thing I saw was that in the first day of the war, Russians targeted military installations and headquarters of the military, but not civilian targets, that means that they wanted to keep, this is a conscious choice, they wanted to keep the Ukrainian leadership alive so that there will be a legitimate leadership who will sign the basically a surrender terms, because that is more useful to the Russians than a puppet regime. But if that government, the legitimate recognized government of Ukraine won't do that, then they will not hesitate in starting to kill off all of the presidents and prime ministers, foreign ministers whatsoever. Yes, I am also very worried about the, you know the joke. It's not a good time to make jokes, but in the end of the Second World War, Stalin did things in Poland and was informed that Pope wouldn't like it, and then Stalin scoffed, well, how many divisions has the Pope have? Well, I'm afraid that the firepower of the Pope is really similar to most countries in Western Europe nowadays. So this is the reason why we're all talking about sanctions.
Yeah, how many divisions do the Germans have? How many divisions do the Hungarians have? How many divisions do the French have? We can do that all the way down. Are you concerned about the United States? I mean, we're seeing things, for example, I think the Royal Welsh lads from the UK are either en route to Estonia or have just arrived. This seems to be the NATO plan, is to put troops into countries that are near Russia, but without actually going to Ukraine directly. Do you think that's going to be enough, or do you think that's just an empty gesture?
No, I don't think it's an empty gesture, but I do think it's basically improvising on the go, because for the past 15, 20 years, people have not really taken seriously the threat of Russia. I have to say, I have always known that Russians are still what they have been for the past, 1,000 years. Every 100 years they invade Estonia. So, so we've always known that, and this is the reason why we wanted to join the NATO. But most people in the Western world and also in the United States have not seen it that way. Of course, a few hundred troops or even a few thousand troops is basically a gesture, and I am always very grateful for that support and at least the moral support. But I do believe that it is basically up to us, the border countries, the Estonia itself, to beef up its military strength, because what we are seeing in Ukraine is very significant. If they hold on for days or weeks, then the calculus changes. Then they will receive help. And it's the same applies to Estonia or Latvia or Poland or Romania. If you can hold on for days or weeks, then the calculus changes. But if you are overrun within a few days, then it's all over for you. So we have to have our own capability to push back or defend and buy time and buy land by retreating, not in panic, but step by step if it comes to that. So first we have to have our own capabilities, and then the allies can come to our help. It's not the other way around.
No, and as you reminded us, your country fought very valiantly against the Bolsheviks just a century ago. And that is likely going to be how it is for all kinds of places that have the misfortune to fall within Vladimir Putin's orbit. Thank you very much for that, Martin Helme. And I'm sorry I mispronounced your name at the beginning of this segment. If you'd like to make like Martin and scrap with the Ruskies, well, the Ukrainian Foreign Legion is recruiting. The Foreign Secretary, her Canadian counterpart, and the Danish Prime Minister all say feel free to pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and head to Kiev. When we return, we will take a look at this issue from the other side of it. Don't touch that dial. We're coming right back.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Until fairly recently, nation-states were governed by national leaders in what they perceived to be the national interests. Even vast empires prosecuted what they considered was the imperial powers' interest. The men who run China and Russia still do. In the West, on the other hand, we seem to have bred a class apart, a ruling elite who regard national interests as vulgar and parochial and instead jet around the planet purporting to represent some sort of global commons. The buffoon John Kerry, who cautioned Putin just the other day that waging war could easily distract from the focus on climate change, is a parody of that. A beloved comic figure, but not untypical. Richard Hanania is here. You can read him on Substack. I did. And he had a very interesting essay on this very theme. Richard, for all the turmoil going on in the world at the moment, you seem to think it would actually be a good thing if this strange kind of American elite in particular were to get a bloody nose and be knocked out of business.
Yeah, I mean, it's, hard to put it like that because you don't want conflicts. You don't want the United States to be embarrassed. I'm an American. I mean, I want the United States to do well abroad and have a strong standing abroad and all that. At the same time, we've had a unique level of recklessness on the world stage. So if you look at things like Russia and China, I mean, they occasionally push people around. They occasionally do things that their neighbors don't like. In the case of Russia, you have several invasions. But there's some limit to sort of their desire to remake the world. It's unthinkable to imagine China spending 20 years in Afghanistan trying to make that country into a liberal democracy, trying to change the culture, trying to improve gender relations there, and then sanctioning the country, after it doesn't work. And now Afghanistan is on the edge of a mass starvation. So, I think there's been a lot of humanitarian costs to what the U.S. is doing abroad, often with the best of intentions, often not. But I think this is a problem for the American people and it's a problem for the world.
Yeah, it doesn't look like any, well, in fact, as Martin, our guest from Estonia, was just saying a few minutes ago, he doesn't really expect anything from America. He's looking for Estonia to take charge of its own destiny. And I read between the lines in that. is that he thinks, oh, for God's sake, the last thing we actually need is Antony Blinken and John Kerry and the rest of the gang descending from the skies and screwing us over the way they did in Afghanistan. That there's a sense now that these people, they get that and they don't want part of it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we're seeing a little bit of that. I mean, but often countries will sort of be emboldened by American promises and do things that are eventually not in their own interest. So in 2008, for example, when the U.S. Under the Bush administration started making a policy to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, it wasn't a coincidence that a war between Georgia and Russia broke out that same year. The U.S. is not going to it's not going to fight for Ukraine. We're not going to go to nuclear war for Ukraine. That's what would basically be implied by a NATO guarantee. And now Ukraine has been so excited by this NATO guarantee that they've put it into their constitution. They've focused their entire foreign policy and relations with Russia on the idea that the U.S. is eventually going to have their back. We're probably not going to do that. And even Zelensky, the poor man, was begging before the war, can you just tell me, can you level with me on NATO and the EU? And we didn't do that. We didn't make the promise to Russia that we wouldn't expand NATO. That could have helped possibly avert the war, and we didn't level with the Ukrainians either. So it's sort of, we get the worst of all worlds often, where we're sort of expected to be there, and sometimes people rely on us, but we're sometimes not. But in the end, we're going to do what's in our own interests. And Ukraine, as bravely as the people are fighting there, that's not vital to American national security. So you can't expect us to be the ones to fight that war.
After the fiasco in Kabul, what do you think it's going to take to get America to go to war again? Because right now, the so-called national security right is the same old guys in Washington, but there's no call for it anywhere on the ground out among the voter base.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the base, gave us Trump. He dragged sort of, against the wishes of the establishment, which was just horrified by the man. But a lot of them, filled up his administration, and it's really going to depend on who the president is. I mean, the president has power in foreign policy like he does nowhere else, and so I thought that we would be maybe a little bit more humble after Afghanistan. It doesn't appear that's the case. I mean, here you have people on Twitter, important people, not just random people, calling for a no-fly zone, potentially nuclear war over Russia.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's
no, I know. I think that's. It went so well with those goatards. Let's bring it to a nuclear power. I mean, that's absolutely incredible to me, Richard. I think this is actually your theme. The particular insanity of America's and other Western elites is actually the big challenge of our times. Getting the John Kerrys to stop going around doing this. And we're going to return to this topic. But your essay at Substack is a great place for people to start on this. And we thank you very much for joining us tonight. Day 5 of Europe at War. We're going to stay on top of it. That'll do it for us for tonight. But Dan Wootton's here to make your Monday for the next 2 hours. Stay safe, stay free.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern. The rain that many places saw during Monday clears overnight. Frosty in the north then, but sunny on Tuesday before it turns milder, cloudier and damp once again from the south. The weather front that's brought the rain is clearing to the southeast as we go into Monday evening and overnight. But it stalls, and that means for parts of East Anglia, the southeast, it stays generally cloudy and damp throughout much of the night. The rain turning lighter, more patchy as the night wears on, however. With the cloud cover in the southeast, it's mild, 7 or 8 Celsius by dawn on Tuesday. But with clearer skies, lighter winds elsewhere, well, fairly widespread frost for the northern half of the UK, certainly, and in some sheltered spots, -2 to -4 Celsius. Still a few blustery showers for the far north and west of Scotland. They do tend to ease through the day on Tuesday. And that means that for many parts of the UK, it's dry and it's bright. The best of the sunshine will be for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England. Increasingly cloudy further south and increasingly damp, particularly for parts of the M4 southwards. Not feeling very pleasant where there's rain and drizzle by the afternoon, of course, but a fine day for much of the northern 2/3 of the UK, I expect. Now, the cloud and the light rain in the south tends to make some progress north during Wednesday early hours. And for much of England, Wales, Northern Ireland, that means a frost-free start to Wednesday, 7 or 8 Celsius. But for Scotland, we keep the clear skies and a widespread frost to begin things Wednesday morning. Lighter winds at first here, but the wind picks up, and that wind will help to push the cloud and rain in the south into parts of southern and central Scotland through the day. With the increased breeze, the increased cloud, not such a pleasant day to come. And there is more rain to come in many places on Thursday, only slowly clearing on Friday. But the spring sunshine returns on the weekend.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows. Every day, we ask the questions that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is